we are. Okay. So welcome to our global call at the last Wednesday of the month, our usual time. Want to welcome everybody. I'll, in a moment, just do a very short introduction to the movement and where we are in it these days. Then we'll have a special presentation that's been created by our learning group. And then we'll really discuss next steps on our 2021 priorities. As you see this, and Anne really well titled this, the Year of National Chapters. We could wind up doubling the number of national chapters this year. We'll talk about next steps in our COVID resilient community process. We'll look at where we are in transforming evaluation and influencing policymakers. And then we'll look at next dates, because there's a lot happening in the month of March. So as you know, or if you're new to this movement, we have 5 goals: voice and agency for women, youth, and groups at risk of marginalization. Shifting not only the power, but the money to communities so that communities have at least 20% of public finance. That laws are set so that there's good local governance at the community level, quality public services, and that communities have what they need to plan for resilience, because resilience is a community attribute. We are growing, as I mentioned, in this year of national chapters. We have 15 wonderful national chapters, some of whom you'll hear from later in this call. But we also have 20 countries that are now in the process of discussing or formulating national chapters. We had a wonderful call with folks in Asia, across 10 countries in Asia the other night. We will continue having calls with organizations, mostly local organizations across Asia, and with networks of organizations in Asia. We also are currently at 72 international NGO members, who we will hopefully be calling on more and more to provide the kinds of resources that are needed in the Shift the Power movement. This, as you'll recognize, is our elegant, very elegant theory of change. We've added a new box to it because evidence for the kind of systems change we stand for is going to be very important. It will both be support efforts of the national chapters and learn data from the experience of the national chapters in achieving these advocacy partnerships for policy change, as well as facilitating partnership at scale. And then hopefully this will push more and more countries on the pathway to national scale for community-led development. With that, I want to hand over to Grace and Sia and Matt for their special presentation. And here are your slides, team. And if you just tell me when you want the next slide clicked, I will click it.
Yeah, I'll start us off. Thank you so much for that introduction, John. Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Laniel. I work as co-chair of the Learning Work Group with Sia Naroji, and we organize periodic learning events for exchange and dialogue. In today's discussion, we'll have 3 speakers for talking for roughly 8 to 10 minutes each, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Without further ado, to introduce our speakers, Grace Boone, who's program manager at CDA, is joining us again today. She's actually spoken to us before, and today she's providing an update on the work of Stopping at Success to share a book publication that they recently completed in December called What Transformation Takes. And this is the topic of the whole conversation today on talking about facilitating transitions from international NGOs to locally led endeavors. And that's also the topic of her book. of the book, sorry, that Stopping at Success published as a consortium. Pauline Wembeti will be the second speaker. She's managing director for Newver Kenya and a longtime collaborator of mine. Pauline is going to talk about her experience being profiled as a case study in the What Transformation Takes book. Now that case study took place and was documented in 2017 and 2018, and all that research was put together in the interim period. And so our last speaker, Sia Naruji, will talk to much more updated and actually very much currently ongoing experience in a transition and her role as executive director of the 3D program for girls and women at the UN Foundation. She's right smack dab in the middle of a process of transferring ownership of the program to partners in India. And so she's going to provide some and really update some of these learnings, particularly in the context of COVID-19 and the entire kind of decolonizing aid, decolonizing development movement, some of the trends. And she's going to offer some reflections that we'll provide and contrast and update some of even the lessons that are documented in the book. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Grace, and John, I think you can advance to the next slide.
That surprises me.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, for that introduction. And thank you, John, and to the movement for hosting us today. I'm really excited to be with you all and to be talking about what transformation takes, both in the context of the Stopping at Success book, but also other experiences of responsible transition. So it's really, really nice to be with you all. You can go to the next slide, John. So I like to start by grounding us in this quote by Marie-Rose Romaine Murphy and Deegan Alley that says, if the goal of aid is about ending aid, then INGOs should have an exit plan and develop new metrics of success for their organizations. Stopping at Success believes that the best way that we can do this is to listen to communities and people with lived experiences in responsible transition processes in order for us to be equipped to understand how to respond to this moment, but also to understand how to authentically partner and create space for local leadership. So it's both out of this demand for evidence on how to transition responsibly, as well as the need to listen for people with lived experiences that What Transformation Takes was born. You can go to the next slide, John. So What Transformation Takes is a compilation of 19 public case studies that were written during the Stopping at Success program. Between 2017 and 2020, Stopping at Success documented 20 cases, 20 stories of transition processes across 13 countries that were then compiled into this book, but also informed 25 tools and resources aimed at supporting INGOs, NGOs, CSOs, and donors who are actively planning or going through a transition process. One thing to note is that the case studies are examples of responsible transitions as defined by the people who lived through the transition process. So they're unique in the sense that they show us how transitions to locally led entities can be transformative and how they can be, how they could shift power to communities, but we recognize that this isn't the norm. And so in this way, the cases teach us how we can do development differently. You can go to the next slide, John. So all that said, the book is organized into 5 sections that are really the themes that evolved as being critical for responsible transition. So we have partnerships, capacity development, leadership, financial sustainability, and communication. It's important to note here that power and legitimacy is not its own theme, which may surprise some of you, but the reason it's not is because it really is a cross-cutting theme across everything. Like every conversation we had, every case we documented, every conversation we held really hit on the topics of power and legitimacy. And so it's really weaved throughout the book. The last thing I'll say about the inside of the book is that all of the sections also contain analysis and link to resources that are relevant to each theme to help development practitioners. You can go to the next slide, John. So all of that being said, what does transformation in the context of transitions mean? So it won't surprise you that the recipe for success really varies for each organization, for each context, but we were able to find common themes that emerged. So both technical and procedural aspects of a transition are important, but also relational and partnership-based features are critical. So a technically perfect transition is incomplete if there are not relational partnership, but also power dynamics that are addressed and acknowledged. So it's really critical for both the INGO and the local entity to really make choices to partner together on transforming inequitable ways of working that are quite common in our sector, as we know. So we have resources that are linked in the slide that will give you more information, but I did want to share a little bit at a high level about what we've seen as before, during, and after transition as critical to responsible transition processes. So two really critical things before, how INGOs enter matter just as much as how they leave. So in order to set up a successful transition down the road, it's really critical for partnerships to be built on a joint vision, to be built on solidarity, trust, and joint decision making. We also see that it's really important, and I know Pauline will talk a bit about this, is having a transition planned before you start. You know, if an INGO plans to leave before programming even begins, the overall process is a lot more locally driven and locally led and owned. During the transition, there are a couple of things. I already mentioned the importance of addressing power imbalances. At every step of the process, it's critical to transfer responsibility, ownership, resources, and power to the local entity or the local staff that are moving things forward after the INGO leaves. Also, not being afraid to fail. I think transitions, they're messy and they're complicated and they're ever evolving processes. And so things that you thought may have been best practice at the beginning may completely be different as you're going through the transition. And so it's really key to ensure that there's room to experiment, there's room to fail, there's room to figure out what makes the most sense for the context, for the community, for the transition itself. And after the transition, I think Neuro Kenya and Neuro International are a beautiful example of this, that post-transition doesn't mean that relationships end. Partnership doesn't have to end the minute the formal partnership ends. There is room to allow the relationship to evolve into new forms during, after the transition process that are really centered around collaboration and solidarity. John, you can go to the next slide. So as Matt mentioned, this research has been conducted a few years ago. A lot has changed in our world since then. So I wanted to take a moment to sort of pause to say that all of this research was conducted prior to COVID. And we know that our sector, our world is a completely different place than it was a year and a half ago. So I wanted to pause to say that I think the research is still relevant, it still applies, there's still things that we can learn from it, but we're also living in an unprecedented moment, in an unprecedented time. Simultaneously, we're seeing, voices growing louder and louder to shift power to people in their own communities, because we are seeing what we've always known, that people in their communities are at the forefront of response and change. But we're also seeing heightened critique of the development sector, right? With systemic injustice, racism, the legacy of colonialism playing out as people who are at the forefront of this response are not being valued the same, paid the same, acknowledged the same. So we're seeing all of this, all of these injustices that we've seen for a long time evolving in this unprecedented time and unprecedented way. So I did want to pause to say that, and then to say, I do think that there are some lessons from SAS that I think are useful during this time, especially as INGOs are closing country offices, they're transitioning at rapid speeds because of the crisis. And so there's a few lessons that we've pulled out on how to transition responsibly, even during this intense time. They're not gonna surprise you. They hit on a lot of the themes that I've already mentioned, but intensive planning, financing the transition process, but also the local entity post-transition to make sure that sustainability is possible. Also that people most closely affected by the pandemic should lead the process, and that we can encourage and fund community-based support. So you can go to the next slide, John. So I just wanted to share our hashtag, the link to the book, my email, the consortium organization social media, in case you want to be in touch. I'm really grateful that we were able to hear from two people, both Pauline and Sia, who have direct lived experience with transition processes and are in a much better place to share the reality of transition processes. So I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to you, Pauline. Thanks so much.
And Grace, we'll put the slide deck on the site after the call so that people can get access to it.
Perfect. Thanks, John.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pauline Wambeti, Managing Director, Nuru Kenya, and I'll walk you through our experience with transition. And you'll find our case study on part 5 of the book on the communicating part. Nuru Kenya is basically a local organization that was founded in the year 2008. And in the next slide, you'll see the vision of the co-founders. There was 2 founders, native of Kenya, of Kuria community, the late Philip Mohochi, and Jake Harriman, who is from the States. And when they came together, their vision was to raise up local leaders who are capable of co-designing integrated solutions to end extreme poverty in remote rural areas throughout the nation. So when they started interacting with the community and engaging them on their level of need, they communicated from the beginning that it is an expatriate-led intervention, but soon the expatriates would hand over the interventions to the community. So even when they were figuring out the projects that would address the needs that they were articulating to their founders, they also were made to understand that these would transition to the local community when the community's capacity had been built to the level where they could continue with the interventions. So one key lesson that you'll find in the book is that when you're setting up yourself for success and transition, you need to plan with the community early. You need to start with the end in mind and ensure that the community understands the vision. They buy into the intention of the donor community being able to transition their projects. Then on the next slide, there was a lot of course, with the planning, we had now to embrace change. Things were not going to continue happening the way they were. And this was a rigorous period for the community. It entailed a lot of learning as transition was being planned and as transition started being implemented. When the expatriate team came in the year 2008, they projected they'll leave in 2013. And there was a lot that needed to be done. Once they had identified the leadership that they would work with, there was a lot of capacity building. But again, there was a lot of transition that needed to be done. You could see from this slide that there was embracing technology. That was something that was not happening previously in the community. And this went right to even the way they practice their livelihoods, because the key was to ensure that they are severing that they are trying to change breaking the cycle of generational poverty. So even inculcating modern farming practices so that they could increase yield for food security, ensuring they inculcate a savings cultures and prioritizing the needs of the household. And by the time 2013 was arriving, there was a cocktail of calamities that hit the community. And so even the departure of the expatriate team became a bit complicated, and so they could not leave. So you'll find that in the next slide, the expatriate team had to be flexible with their timelines of departure. And that is another lesson learned that we've articulated in our case study. Transitioning is also a very patient process. They had to work with the local community, go back to the drawing board and evolve the solutions that were working previously from 2008 to 2013 and look at what else needs to be done, because it would not have been really sustainable for them to live at that time. The community was experiencing maize lethal necrosis disease. There was drought, there was flooding in some areas. And so the farmers had lost a lot of crops, despite the fact that they had embraced technology, they had really learned a lot of knowledge and skills on how to improve their livelihoods and engage in profitable livelihoods. So from the slide, you can see we had to diversify our livelihoods, not just rely on the crop intervention, but also embrace dairy. It's a community that is in a remote area, but they love animals, although cattle rustling was really prevalent at that time. So even changing the breed of animals so that we could now have improved breeds that were high yielding. And then looking at the entities that would continue to supply these farmers with quality inputs, because government subsidy had come to an end in 2013. And so we even had to change the strategy. And by 2015, when the expatriate team were leaving, we were now not working directly with farmers, but we were working now with farmer-led organizations, and in our context, those are cooperatives. So we had to empower the community to actually take charge and design structures that were sustainable for them, so that when the expatriate team left, then they would have sustainable structures that would continue to support the implementation of their solutions. So in the next slide, you'll see when the expatriate team left in 2015, they had trust that the local team could drive the intervention. They also were able to relinquish decision-making and relinquish also the resources. So the local team was now able to take a step further and continue to regenerate that investment that had been made by the expatriate team. And that is what has happened with Nuru Kenya. We now have Nuru stores. Instead of us working directly with farmers, we now have a store that is able to provide what the farmers need. We have a feed mill that is supporting the farmers to get quality feeds. We have a milk processing plant that is providing ready market for the farmers who are engaged in dairy farming. And so they are cushioned even from exorbitant or fluctuating prices of their milk product. We even have an institute that is going now to continue to offer the skills and knowledge that the community needs to continue with their dairy management practices, poultry management. It's offering courses on soil management, agripreneurship, and horticulture. And this has is now the instructors who are going to work in this institute have recently completed their qualification requirements, so they are recognized by the government, and this institute is actually open for students and farmers countrywide. So you'll find when the local team is well equipped and then given that room to learn and innovate and be creative, they know the challenges they experience themselves, then it becomes possible for them to come up with innovative and sustainable ideas that will continue to work for the future generations. In the next slide, you'll also see this did not stop at that time. Just because the expatriate team left does not mean that transition has come to an end. As we evolve solutions, we also evolve the way transition happens. That the expatriate left the intervention in the hands of the local team in an NGO that is locally led. But then again, the community also has their own structures, and we need as a local NGO to also empower the community to take up these interventions and run them themselves. So that is why you see in this slide, we are actually empowering the cooperatives now to do the process, to do the cooling of their milk, even make decisions on the price that they're selling their products. They now aggregate their produce on their own, and they determine the pricing of the products. And so they are also able to determine how they invest the income they receive. So in a nutshell, I would say you'll discover that what we realized was in the case study, you'll realize that some of these lessons that we learned, we were able to articulate in the study, that you have to plan with the community early.
Speaking, Sia is next, I think.
Then we have to be flexible with the timelines, ensure that do not be rigid, because projects are dynamic and solutions are also need to evolve with changing situations. Then be patient about it, give the community room to learn, even from failure, make mistakes and recover. Then let accountability be both ways. It's not just the donor holding the community, the NGO accountable or the staff. It's also the community being empowered to hold the implementers or the development facilitators accountable. Then relinquishing control, which is a very difficult process because you are relinquishing a lot of investment, but that was very key, making sure that even decision-making has been transitioned to the lower levels, and then acknowledging that there is need for continued but evolving support, because the relationship that we've had with Nuru International as the founders is now evolving and it's different. They started hands-on with the implementation, but right now, and then they went to being advisors, and right now they're actually at a higher strategic level, and their kind of support has continued to evolve to the level where they are drawing down their support to the local NGO. So I would say those are the key lessons that you'll find in our case study. And in the next slide, you'll see this is a household that we impact, one of the many that we impact in the 14 cooperatives that we work with. We've now replicated our best practices to 3 other counties. We started initially in Migori County, and we are now in Baringo and Homa Bay County. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. Sia?
Thank you so much, John, and the movement for having me here. And many thanks to Grace and Pauline for sharing their longtime wisdom in this space. I am going to share the experience of the 3D program over the past few months and where we are right now in the middle, as Matt said, smack dab in the middle of our transition of transferring ownership of our program from a DC-based team to our local partners in India. I'm going to share both sort of organizational and institutional experiences, as well as some of my personal reflections on where we are right now. Next slide, please, John. So adding to Grace and Pauline's great wisdom, I wanted to share a couple of quotes. One is from the great Bob Marley, who spoke the truth so eloquently in saying, "Who feels it knows it." There is nothing better than local knowledge to guide local programs. That is unquestionable. That's the starting point. And then a more recent quote from Dr. Joyce Banda, speaking to the movement in January: "Community-led development is a formidable task because it requires not just having a deep respect for communities, but the courage to step away, relinquish control, and see the power of sustained transformation emerge." Next slide, please, John. So for those of you who may not know, the 3D program has been working in the space of advancing gender equality and girls and women's empowerment. From 2017 to 2021, we've been doing this in partnership with 3 main stakeholders: civil society, the private sector, and local government officials in Pune district, Maharashtra state in India. We have worked across sectors with a focus on economic empowerment, health, education, and public safety. And in 2020, in the words of Dr. Banda, we made the decision to step away. Next slide, please, Anne. So the backdrop of that decision is not unique. Grace spoke very eloquently about this. The first factor in that backdrop, of course, was COVID-19. It impacted the way that we worked operationally, and it had a huge impact on the availability and the allocation of resources. We pivoted our programs, our models were stress tested and really showed their value. So we came away both with a real validation, because our decentralized women-led platforms were really filling gaps where government systems have been failing during COVID responses, and really serving as important conduits of supplies, information, and services. But it also pushed us to really think about how we needed to use and allocate resources in a shrinking space. And it forced us to think about what would happen if we took our DC-based team off the budget. The global reckoning around social justice and international development that Grace spoke about really sort of surfaced many of the dynamics that all of us working in this space are aware of, and pushed us to really think about, okay, if we were going to do this, if we were going to transfer ownership of the program to the partners in India, how should we do this in an intentional way that was cognizant of these dynamics and took them into account? A more internal component of what guided our decision, though, was actually the nature of our partnerships. They started out from the beginning, and I think just really grew in deep respect and trust, and really sort of a clear understanding of the relative advantages that we all brought to the table. And that, I think, is what helped us make the decision in full confidence that we know the program is going to thrive with our partners. And it also enabled us to have deep and honest discussions with each other and our partners about what this transition would entail and would mean. Next slide, please. And in fact, our partnerships really sort of reflected some of the principles that Grace talked about the importance of paying attention to relationships in these processes before, during, and after transitions. And our partnerships reflected some of the principles of collaboration that this movement has teased out, that Gunjan has really articulated well. So having a shared purpose, being adaptable and flexible, as Pauline mentioned, and respect and mutual accountability really guiding everything that we do. The next slide. So what is it that we were transitioning out of? We are a small DC-based team. We were leading strategy, providing funding, doing a lot of documentation of lessons learned, and linking the work on the ground to global platforms. We worked very closely with a consortium of partners in Pune district who were leading the implementation on the ground, providing strategic advice throughout the process and really ground truthing the whole process. Our way of working was consultative within certain parameters. We knew going in that we thought local government was an important partner, and for many of the partners we ended up working with, that was sometimes a point of contention, sometimes a point of negotiation. And each partner brought their own parameters to the table, and through consultations, we found some common ground and agreement. We have and had, pre-COVID and during COVID, consistent online and phone communication, so really close contact with our partners as a group and also one-on-one. And pre-COVID, we would have regular in-person interactions with members of the DC team traveling to India 3 times a year for a sustained period of time. And those trips were very catalytic and also important for building the relationships that we had. So we've felt the loss of those kind of interactions. So this is essentially the structure. It's not unique. I think it's fairly typical for how a lot of international NGOs do work. And this is the structure that we are now transitioning out of. Next slide, please, John. So our transition has been consultative and intentional within a short time frame. It doesn't show the intentionality, I think, of Nuru's process, which began at the beginning. Ours began in May last year when we said, wait a minute, let's look at what COVID is doing. Let's look at the funding situation. Let's look at what we need to do. We gave ourselves until September to make a firm decision. And at that point decided, yes, we are going to take the DC team out of the picture and transfer the program to our partners in India. So we identified 3 phases in this process. The first one was strategy and buy-in. The the first thing we did was talk to all our partners, really to get a sense of, was there any interest in them moving forward with the program without us? If so, what shape and form would it take? We consulted with our donor, with UN Foundation, which is our host organization, and we consulted with our program advisory committee. We assessed our resources. What were the resources we had? How far could we take them? How much could we reallocate to partners, especially looking forward as we took ourselves off the budget? And we did a stakeholder analysis really related to the transition process. So really understanding who was it we had to have on board, who was critical, who might get in our way, and who else we needed to engage along the way to have a successful transition and really work with our partners to set them up for success through the transition process and beyond it. The second stage, which is mostly where we are now, is planning and action. We came up with work plans for ourselves as the DC team, both programmatic and operational. We came up with a fundraising plan, looking to leverage our contacts with global funders, as well as really deepening our engagement through our partners with India-based donors. As I said, we looked at the budget and we began the process of reallocating whatever funds we could to our partners so that they would have the support to engage in a strategic planning process for the transition and not just be unduly burdened by our decision. We worked with each partner to come up with a strategic plan that we are now all trying to follow. We're getting into the last phase, which is completion and reflection. Our partners are beginning to reach out to local government officials to get the necessary approvals secured for each of their endeavors. We are working on funds. We have not yet secured funds for the scale up, but we're working on that. Our partners have begun their individual planning processes for scale up. We are documenting and sharing lessons learned. This is a great opportunity for us to share something of our process and also get some feedback as well. So we're grateful for that. And another piece of work that we're working on is actually supporting each other to secure jobs and other positions as we move out of these current positions. And ultimately, the goal by mid this year, maybe into the third quarter, is having the DC operations completely shut down. Next slide, John, please. So a few surprises so far. The first one was we realized that we had never intended to stay. This was not a permanent program. And in fact, we had said from the beginning, we were demonstrating a model that we would then share our lessons learned about. But despite this, and contradicting both Grace and Pauline's recommendation, we didn't go in with an exit strategy. And it wasn't a surprise because that was the reality, but we suddenly realized a couple of months ago, like, wait a minute, we should have been doing this before, and we hadn't. The other big surprise was we had really prided ourselves on convening the perfect mix of partners. We have a great consortium of partners. I don't know how we could have gotten a better one. But in our conversations with those partners, each of them made the decision that they didn't want to continue working as a consortium. They wanted to work individually or bring in new partners. So that was a surprise, and that was one of our takeaways, and we've moved forward and planned accordingly. Another surprise, which was quite validating actually, was that each partner, even as they wanted to move forward individually, wanted to move forward with the same component of the program, and that was our village women's committees. So we realized this was validating, this was the value add of the 3D program, and as we step away, this is the enduring piece, we hope. And then a surprise is, it's somewhat operational, but I think it's mostly emotional, that once the decision was made and once the planning began, the balance shifted very quickly and the change of roles began to happen quicker than I thought it would. So the partners are now playing a leadership role, moving forward with their strategic planning, moving forward with what they need to do to make this happen. And the DC team is now really in a supporting role. Next slide.
Sorry, my computer jumped into a different place.
No problem, John.
Oh, there we are. Okay. Next slide.
So I'm going to end with a few of my personal reflections, actually, on what I think of as a work in progress. So this really has been a real privilege for me. I became executive director of the 3D program right before we made the decision to transition. So my key responsibility has been shepherding this process, and it has been a real learning for me. It's been a privilege, and I'm continuing to make sense of it as we're in the middle of it. So I really think that there are three streams of work in this transition. The first is programmatic, really figuring out what components do you continue with, what do you build on, how do you do that the best way? The second is operational, really all the nuts and bolts of shutting down an operation here in DC and making sure that the partners have what they need to move forward. And the third is emotional. And that really kind of took me by surprise. It shouldn't have, but it did. That suddenly one day it hit me and I just thought, wow, there are a lot of emotional processes that we need to pay attention to. Most of us working in this space are doing so because we care very deeply about the work. Most of our partnerships are based on relationships that go well beyond the work. And so I think in this process, you need to allow yourself and others the time to both celebrate these things and to grieve them. I think it's part of what Pauline called learning to embrace change. And just allowing yourself and your colleagues the time and space to do that. So we've had some wonderful times of celebration and we've had some tears, and it's been bittersweet. The other thing that we have tried to be really transparent about are the economic consequences to these transitions on both sides. We are, as I said, reallocating resources to our partners so that the transition process is not an additional work stream without resources, but that they are given the financial resources to move it forward in a meaningful way. And we have also, as a DC team, made a decision to be very transparent that we all need to move on to other positions. There are economic consequences for each of us. And as a team, we've made a commitment to support each other in our job searches. And that has been quite liberating and really wonderful to be able to count on your team and say, hey, I have an interview, or could you give me a reference, or could you brainstorm with me about whether this would be a good position, has been really a wonderful part of this process in seeing that kind of support and experiencing that kind of support. Next slide, John, please. The other reflection that I've been having is, talking about the global reckoning around international development and the conversations around racism and decolonization. For us at the 3D program, we have not been operating in a simple north-south dichotomy. We have really learned from our partners about the way they organize for social justice and are supporting each other. And they, I think, have learned from us in terms of strategy and linking to global processes. We've all seen how inequalities manifest everywhere, particularly through COVID, how systems are failing everywhere. And it's less of a developing model that we're operating under. And then there are some of us who actually exist in the spaces in between. 2 out of 3 of our members are of Indian origin. Our founder was born and grew up in India, and that was the reason she founded the program and wanted to work in Maharashtra state. I am of Indian origin from Kenya and have family in Maharashtra. And so for us, there was a going home in a way. There was some understanding that existed There was some surprises by how at home and how easy it sometimes felt. And then of course, how not at home and how difficult it could sometimes feel. So not to say that there are not differences and there are not power imbalances, but to say that it's more complex than a simple us and them, and that those dynamics need to be taken into account in these transitions. And with the global community being what it is, my suspicion is that is the reality for many of us in the space. And then my personal reflection really goes back to the nature and quality of our partnerships and how lucky we have been with them, and how much the attention to those relationships has paid off. That really, I have no doubts, the work will go on, the model will be scaled up and grow in the best possible way, in the hands of the most capable and most knowledgeable people. I'll stop there and thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sia and Grace and Pauline. It was just a wonderful presentation. As they stated at the beginning, we have some time for Q&A. If you have a question you want to pose to the panel, you can just unmute and say it. Or you can use the little raise hand feature and I'll call on you. Either's fine.
We also have a few, oh, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I put the question in the chat earlier, so I'll say it now.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. In the second step of your process, you talk about strategic planning. I was wondering, is that strategic planning for the transition process or strategic planning for the local partner for after the break?
Thanks, Frank. It was strategic planning for each partner, to sort of come up with a design process for how they would move the piece of work forward. And so we did that jointly, but they led that process and we were giving feedback and support.
So it's really more of a process to help them integrate your activities into their existing programs?
So they are the implementers of our activities right now, but how they decided to move it forward, what scaling up would look like, what pieces they wanted to keep, what pieces they wanted to let go of, those kind of issues, and of course a budget.
So it's basically programmatic strategic planning.
Yes, it is. Yes,
not so much organizational.
Not so much, although they had to assess their operations to see what was possible. Yeah. Yeah.
Sia, I see we have other Norajis on the call. Do you want to introduce them?
I would love to. These are my darling parents, Feroz and Bilu Navroji, tuning in from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah, wonderful seeing you all. Do we have I have a question of both Pauline and Sia. My organization, the Hunger Project, has always, our exit strategy was always never to enter, to find local leaders who wanted to run a program, with us. And then they also developed exit strategies for their communities. I know Nuru's program has been more kind of technologically focused. Do you think your programs could have worked that way? Could have worked by starting with local leadership and kind of Sia or Pauline, either?
Sorry, John, I couldn't hear you.
Oh yeah, there was another voice cutting in, I noticed. So the question was, my organization has always had a policy of never entering. That is, we start with local leaders who want to run the program and lead the program locally. And then they also develop exit strategies with communities that they're working with. Do you think 3D or Nuru could have worked in that way of never being an expat-led program?
Okay, I guess for the Nuru case, I could say that there is the leadership program that was developed during
Right.
the entry point by the expatriate team. But I would say from the experience I've encountered working with other development projects elsewhere, that it's important for that physical connection because you get to impart skills faster, and you also, both the expatriate team and the local team are able to learn a lot from each other. So I would say for us, it worked with the expatriate team being on the ground, empathizing with what the local leadership was experiencing in the dynamics, and it helps to understand some of the issues that will emanate after the transition has happened.
Mm-hmm.
They will now be able to contextualize why are decisions being made this way? Why, for instance, did we drop the technology that the expatriate team were using when they left, and we really
Right.
changed the way they were doing things? So if there is that continued support that is going to happen, and for our case, there was the continued funding that comes from Nuru International, then it is important for the expatriate team to empathize with the situation on the ground so that after they leave, they can comprehend some of those dynamics.
Very well said. Thank you.
I think, John, for 3D, we went in saying we are not seeing enough work on gender equality being done across sectors and across stakeholders.
Right.
And so we went in saying, would it be useful for us to introduce a model that brought together local government with civil society, with the private sector? Is that a gap? Is that a value add? And we got a resounding yes. And we also kind of, as we went along, began to realize there was value in being an external partner, that we were able to leverage that role to catalyze things, to spark relationships, to create bridges where they didn't exist. So could we have left earlier without the nudge of COVID and everything else? Yes, but I think starting out, we were introducing something different. But we did spend a lot of time validating that to make sure that was the case.
Got it.
See, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm very curious, very interested in the slide that you showed that what remained. First of all, there was a lack of interest in partnerships with other affiliates, but also what remained was the community committees. So it seems like the model, when people in their own became simplified, so what remained and what was shucked off? I was really curious about that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That actually has been an important part of our process, is figuring out why and what that was. So the way we started actually was bringing together the government officials and all the different stakeholders at the district level. And then we realized we needed to move it to the block level, which is the next administrative level down, and then the village level. And those village committees reflected what we were doing at the block and the district level, in that they brought together girls and women, but they also brought together government functionaries and elected officials at the village level to create a multi-sectoral space for girls and women to identify their priorities, identify solutions they wanted, and also hold those government officials accountable. So what shifted for us was not necessarily what happened wasn't necessarily a simplification, but that our focus moved from the district level to the village level. And then we realized what we were calling convergence. It is only sustainable when it's demand driven. And it's only sustainable when that demand is coming from the ground up. And so that's the piece that we are now saying, okay, and that's the piece our partners are saying, that's what we want to hold onto, and that's what we want to scale up. So from 5 villages in Pune district, Maharashtra state, the ambition now is to scale up all over the state of Maharashtra, as well as into Madhya Pradesh as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Sia.
Go ahead.
Demand driven is a very tricky issue when you are working with the community. How about demand creation? There is an issue of fatalism in the community, accepting poverty as something supernaturally given or condemned to be like that.
I think, Teshom, when I say demand driven, I'm saying that the women themselves said, we want these committees, and they actually are helping us. They're giving us a platform that doesn't exist, because actually in rural India, there is very good rural governance structures, but women and girls are excluded from them. So when I say demand, it's that we're continually checking in with the women. Is this something that is useful for you? Is this something that you want to continue and to build on? And the answer is not a yes.
Understood.
Any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, I do have a question. This is Leanna from WEMA International. Great presentations, thank you. As probably a question for Pauline and Sia, or Grace maybe from other case studies. You all mentioned the importance of partnerships with local government. We partner very closely with local district government, but a challenge often is high turnover, even just in implementation. And I was wondering, how much was that a challenge in your transition processes, and any lessons learned in that regard?
Leanna, that has been a huge ongoing challenge, and it was exacerbated by COVID, where many of our champions in local government were transferred out during the crisis. And then of course, they are also just on their administrative cycles and also at the whim of politicians. So it has been a huge issue. It has reinforced for us the importance of having community-based partners who create that continuum and continue that ongoing, very intensive work to create relationships at all levels of local government. We found the personal assistants were incredibly important, cultivate a relationship with them, and they could often get us through the transitions and the changes. Creating MOUs with a department rather than an individual was also really important, but it's a big issue. It's an ongoing challenge, I think.
Yeah, for the Nuru Kenya experience, I would say the government was initially quite skeptical about the continuity and sustainability of our interventions. They're mostly present as regulators. And I would say we had to do a lot of communication, relationship building, so that they could buy into the idea and even support the community structures that were coming up, especially the cooperatives. And over time, they've grown to acknowledge and appreciate our effort. And that has also transited into them even now funding these entities directly. So that is a huge indicator of the confidence they have, and they have become very supportive. But initially it was all uphill, and we had to do a lot to gain that confidence and backing from them.
Any other questions from anyone before we move on? Okay, well, I want,
Wait,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, you got a quick comment. I really am interested in the reaction to the consortium, Sia. You said you had the consortium, but when you decided to transfer power down, the groups decided not to stay in the consortium. So it'd be an interesting study there. What did they see the benefits of the consortium about? What was the vision and mission that held it together while you guys were in it, but wasn't going to keep people together in it as you devolve power and decision-making and stuff? It'd be interesting.
I agree, Frank. I think it's something that requires more conversation, and even once the transition is done, to do some looking back as well, to see, you know, how is it working differently now that we're not this consortium. It was never a formal consortium, it was informal. I think some of the decision-making was operational, that in some ways it's easier just to move forward on our own. different kinds of partners were emerging throughout our process, the decision then to say, okay, we will work with another partner instead of this particular group. But it is interesting.
Oh, well, that makes sense. If it was informal, was relatively fragmented, and then, so the energy to actually make it formal was probably more than people wanted to look at, considering that they were going to have to formalize and take over the work being done.
Yes, and we were really sort of that, we were the magnet at the center of that. So once we step back, then
like I said, it hadn't been formalized around a vision and mission that people have bought into. It was we said informal, I would call it fragmented, where people are working to get out of it what's in their own best interest and working together just to, get what we can get out of it, what's helpful for us, which is working with you guys and learning from others. But it didn't sound like it was formalized into a organization with a vision and mission and leadership and processes and stuff.
in some ways it was. I mean, we were all
At very low levels, what I'm saying, right?
Yes. We were working under one MOU with the local government partner, for example. We were sharing lessons learned. We were coordinating. We had a common staff member who was working across local partners. So in some ways, as I said, it was a surprise. But I think, that doesn't mean this isn't a perfectly good way forward as well.
Oh, no, it actually makes a lot of sense, because the energy it takes for groups to actually maintain that structure is high.
That's right.
And unless the benefits are also high,
Yep.
And actually it may come back later as people get.
Yes, that's right. I think it may continue to evolve. Yeah.
And an important consideration for this whole movement. Okay, everybody, we are going to move on, but Sia, Grace, Pauline, thank you again. And thank you, Matt, for getting this, co-getting this thing together. And we'll, as I mentioned, this is recorded. We'll have this and the slide deck up on the website as soon as we can after the call. So I'm going to go back to the slides for a moment. I did want to promote briefly the progress that was made last year during the pandemic. If you've not read sort of this highlights document that's on our website, please do, and you may want to create them in your own chapters as well. I know that there has been just an enormous energy and creativity coming in through this whole COVID period, and Anne has created this amazing national chapters report that's on the website, and which I highly recommend. And I just wanted to pause here for a second and just see if Anne, if there's any hot news from the national chapters that you want to make sure is present on the call here.
Thank you, John. Everyone who is on the call who is from one of our national chapters, a special welcome to you and thanks for joining the global call. Our 2020 saw our biggest year ever with our chapters, both in terms of new chapters and the chapters ramping up their focus and their activities, their responses to COVID and all kinds of incredible things. So many amazing civil society organizations that are domestic to those countries, really driving those chapters forward. If you're interested in finding out more, let us know. If you want to join the listserv of one of the chapters, one or more, it's easy to do on the website. And as far as 2021 goes, we are looking at really even just fast forwarding our work and being even more intense than ever. So we have a lot of accomplishments we're going to focus on, and we encourage everyone to get involved. So and to keep up on what's been going on. So thanks, John, for that opportunity.
Oh, you're very welcome. So as many of you know, last month was a real breakthrough for our movement. We had an extraordinary call to launch the first findings from the collaborative research team. And we're honored by the amazing leadership of Dr. Joyce Banda, who's really now devoting her energies full-time to community-led development in Malawi. And we've also recently seen a lot of action around the tools, including a new mobile version. So I'd like to turn this over to Gunjan to just update us on that, as well as update us on next steps around COVID resilience.
Thank you, John. So I have just put the link to the tools, to the mobile version of the tool actually in the link, the one that John was just sharing with us. It's in the chat box. Thank you everyone who's been a part of the research. Thank you everyone who's been over this last month sending us amazing feedback on the tools and the reports. We've had over 300 downloads, actually close to 400 downloads of each of the tools now. We know a lot of organizations are planning to roll it out. If you need any support as you plan to go ahead with the rollout, please get in touch with us. We are trying to see if we can create small support groups where we can work together through any issues that arise and look at the best way of, rolling out the tools. If you have already used the tools or if you've adapted them for using in your organizations, again, please share with us. We are very interested. We've increasingly in the last month, as the tools have rolled out and as more and more organizations have started using them or looking at them, we've increasingly heard from people how they would love to share experiences and to kind of strengthen this cross-learning experience. So we are very soon going to start a dialogues platform, which would allow us, as we use these tools, as we apply these tools, to share with each other and learn from each other what our experiences have been. Because any tool is a living instrument, we also wanted to keep improving and growing. But so please feel free to reach out if you are rolling it out, have feedback or need support in doing this. We are also trying to see how different groups of people may use it. For instance, conversations around how would this tool be adapted if it's used at the community level? What would facilitation look like there? What would it look like for donor agencies? And we have donor agencies who are considering using these tools and rolling them out, What would it mean what would it mean if governments were to use them? Can they use them? So we are having a lot of conversations around the tools. You are welcome to join them. So if you're interested in any of them, please reach out to us. Also, the report is out on the website. I will put in the links as soon as I'm done speaking. But the report is there, the tools are there. So if you have any feedback on the report, please reach out to us. So that's on the research part of it. Meanwhile, we are going ahead with the second part of the research. So what we came out with now was what is happening in community-led development? What are organizations doing as part of MCLD programming? In our next phase, we are actually looking at the impact. What happens when community leadership and facilitation are the key, right? So what is the process of change that takes place and how do they lead to improved resilience and other outcomes? And we should get some more results and interesting findings across to you soon. That's a collaborative research update. The second part, which is the COVID calls. So as many of you know that we started doing the COVID calls in April last year, the monthly COVID calls. A lot of you have been part of it. So thank you for bringing in all that richness and all your ideas, all your issues to those calls. We have through the last year tried to address major issues on how do we adjust our own programming to respond to COVID-19. Our next COVID call is on the 10th of March. And what we're going to look at now is we're going to shift focus a little bit. So far we've had people from WHO and others come and talk about vaccine. We've talked about strategy planning. We've talked about, the difficulties and the innovations that we've been having. But I think what's become very clear in the last year is that we are not going to go back to the same world, the world that existed before COVID-19. We know that the realities have changed. We know poverty, food security, all of those issues have been impacted. And so the world, even if COVID goes away, and when it goes away, is going to look very different from what it was before COVID-19. And so what we are going to focus on now, beginning March 10th, is what does this mean for us in the longer term? So far, we've talked about our short-term responses and innovations. Now we're going to look at what does this mean for us long-term, for our programming, for our work, and for our sector. If any of you would like to share what you have been doing in this regard, if you've thought about the long-term implications on your own work and programming, please get in touch. We would be very happy to bring you into these calls. And I look forward to seeing you on the 10th of March. John?
Wonderful. Thank you, Gunjan. So jumping back here. Oops. Share. Application. Okay. Boink. Boink. Sorry, I talk when I hit buttons. So let me talk a bit about policy advocacy and communications. As you know, in addition to the 600 or so of us who are active participants in the movement across about 30 countries, we also need to get our voice heard by policymakers in our own countries and in the international system. That means I really call on each of us to get folks that we know that have a maybe not an active interest in participating in the movement, but would really like to learn what we're learning, because this localization agenda, this overall process of shifting the power from donors to communities, from central governments to communities, from big international agencies to communities, that is front of mind these days for lots of policymakers, and they are not yet on our mailing list. So please invite people to subscribe, forward your copies of the monthly email. We send it out after each of these calls with highlights from the month. So the next day or so it'll go out. But, and I would really love to know the names of people who are social media people in your organization, so that we can have a more coordinated movement, communication, social media strategy. Our awesome colleague intern has just set up an Instagram channel, say, for our MCLD website. So please do share our materials. Let us know about your materials that we should be following and sharing, so that we can really amplify our voices even beyond these wonderful megaphones. So as was mentioned, there's a lot happening in the month of March. March 8th is International Women's Day, which for a network whose #1 goal is ensuring women's voice and agency in community decision-making, the theme this year is really the role of women in public decision-making. So that will be big. If you are doing events on International Women's Day or through the following UN Commission on the Status of Women, I would love to know about it so that I can share it with members and that we can all amplify each other's investments in organizing these events. So please let us know about those. Gunjan mentioned the call that's coming up on the 10th. And at the beginning of the call, I mentioned, and I see some of you who are on the Asia call are also on this call, but we are going to start having a call that's late at night on Eastern time to really work during the workday across Asia. We now have lots of people interested from Afghanistan and Pakistan in Western Asia through to the Philippines. And we had, as I mentioned, we had a great call. We're reaching out at the recommendation of those participants to a number of other Asian networks. And we're going to start this year with a series of calls focused on experience sharing in Asia. We'll let everybody in the movement know when those are, because there's always been a lot of wonderful learning across Latin America, Asia, and Africa. For those US-based organizations, the Interaction Forum is coming up on the 23rd and 24th. Many of us will be having virtual events as part of the Interaction Forum. If you are, again, if you want it communicated out through our platform, let me know and I'll share it. And then the next of these calls will be on March 31st. And you'll hear a lot more about what we'll be focused on in that next global call in the days ahead. So with that, I will return myself to gallery view. And we do have a few minutes left. If there's anything anyone would like to share with the group before we close off. Deanna, I'm looking at you. Any news from Mexico that you would like to share?
Hi, John. Well, actually, we're in the movement. We're struggling a little bit defining we defined 5 priorities last year, and we're trying to land what we're going to do. And right now, the participation topic in Mexico is kind of hard in the political context. But what we're working on is on how to strengthen the social participation and the active citizen participation for really changing these dynamics in power for the elections this year. So we're trying to define that as a chapter, and this is something that we really need to work with for this year. So yeah. I think that's our main goal for the next weeks.
Very good.
And also trying to land all the tools that Gunji just said. We're starting working with that. So we'll have some news pretty soon, I hope.
Oh, wonderful. And you all saw in the chat from Bishop Seth his appreciation for joining the movement. Yes, Seth, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, John, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be part of this, and where I am serving in a rural places, preaching the gospel. I have been also meeting people saying, being saved alone is not enough, but we have other needs. Because, for example, they say the clothes we have borrowed from other people, and when we cannot get them, next Sunday we will not come to church. So I've been thinking and praying. Now I find many people worldwide who have a heart like me, who like to build bridges and to be bridges again, and also to bring light in a community. So I'm very happy to be part of this community. And thank you so much, John, for connecting with me and also connecting to all these people. Burundi, we pray that one day a chapter will be opened in Burundi, and we welcome you and for prayers and also for support for any kind. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Seth. Yes, I painted your country orange on our world map so that it'll stay in my consciousness because Burundi is a vibrant but small country. So we're really delighted. Yes. We're really delighted to have you on our calls. Swinging to the other side of Africa, Pascal, anything you want to share with us all before we close the call?
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. Just one thing. We are very, very excited in the Benin CLD chapter about the dissemination of the CLD tools. And we have just talked about that because we find that another use we can make of those tools could be in support to governance, particularly the social accountability. How we use those tools in a memorandum of understanding between the local local government council and the communities. That is one aspect we are really working on. And that would be great. We have already discussed this with Gunjan, and we'll be grateful for all support we could get from the Global Secretariat and all of you. Thank you, John.
That's wonderful. And it's in French too. So that's very great. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, well, I think we've completed our agenda for today. And we will you'll see in the chat has a link to the upcoming events around generation equality, which I know our colleagues in Mexico have also been super involved with. So we'll get information out to everyone. Watch your inboxes sometime tomorrow in the next 24 hours for our newsletter from all the events that have taken place in February and updates on what's coming up in March. Thank you all for spending today with us, and good luck with all of your work. Thanks again. And thank you again to the learning group for this wonderful presentation today. Bye for now.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Thanks,
John.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.